In the history of World War II, when people think of prisoners of war, many immediately recall the infamous Nazi concentration camps in Europe, where millions were held under inhumane conditions. Yet on the other side of the conflict, there is a largely untold story: the journey of over 370,000 German prisoners held in the United States from 1943 to 1946. This is not only a lesser-known chapter of the global war, but also reflects a unique aspect: how America, with its resources and legal traditions, treated enemies who had once taken up arms against it. The story begins in the North African campaign. After the German-Italian forces were defeated in Tunisia in May 1943, hundreds of thousands of Axis soldiers, most of them German troops from General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps, fell into Allied hands. This was one of the largest collective surrenders of World War II, with nearly 275,000 Germans alone. Keeping such a massive number of prisoners in North Africa or transporting them to Britain was impractical, as Europe remained an intense battlefield, and Britain's logistical resources were severely strained. At this point, the United States emerged as the optimal solution. With its vast territory, rail system, and modern infrastructure, America was fully capable of receiving and managing large numbers of POWs. From mid-1943, massive ships began crossing the Atlantic, carrying tens of thousands of German prisoners to U.S. ports, where they were then distributed to camps across more than 40 states. For the young German soldiers, mostly between 18 and 25 years old, the journey to the U.S. was beyond imagination. They had endured the harsh months in the North African desert, witnessing comrades die of thirst or fall to bombs, only to end up in enemy hands. In their minds still echoed the Nazi propaganda, claiming that American soldiers were savages who would abuse, starve, or slowly kill POWs. This fear made many board the ships in despair, some even believing it was a one-way trip to a death camp. Yet what they encountered en route was entirely different. The American guards neither beat nor humiliated them, but performed their duties with composure. They were given water and basic rations on board. Upon arriving at ports such as New York or Boston, many German soldiers were stunned by the skyscrapers and massive industrial complexes they had never imagined. America, previously depicted in propaganda leaflets as a rotten land, now appeared as a wealthy, modern country, not the ruthless place they had been led to fear. From the ports, prisoners were transported by train deep into the interior. Southern states like Texas, Louisiana, Arkansas, and Midwestern states, such as Iowa, Nebraska, and Kansas, became the main sites for POW camps. The reasons were clear. These regions were far from the front lines, posed little risk of German rescue attempts, and had numerous farms in need of labor. The camps were built to relatively uniform standards: barbed wire fences, watchtowers at each corner, barracks made of wood or brick, with beds, blankets, mess halls, showers, and even infirmaries. While not comparable to freedom, the conditions were a positive shock relative to what the prisoners had imagined. Many later admitted that when they first entered the camps, they could not believe these were the enemy's prisons. The first surprise was the food. According to the 1929 Geneva Convention, the detaining power had to provide rations equal to those of its own soldiers. The United States strictly adhered to this regulation. As a result, the meals German POWs received were often more abundant than what their families were enduring back home under severe wartime shortages. They were served meat, eggs, bread, vegetables, and even coffee and milk. During holidays like Christmas or Thanksgiving, the camps held special meals with turkey, mashed potatoes, and pastries. In some camps, prisoners were also given beer or cigarettes as controlled entertainment. These luxuries, unimaginable even for many Europeans at the time, left German soldiers both amazed and confused. They wondered, why would the enemy feed us so well? Was it a trick to make them let their guard down? Beyond the food, the behavior of the American guards was equally surprising. Instead of cursing or striking them, the guards maintained a calm but fair demeanor. Camp rules were strictly enforced, but there was no personal humiliation. Some older prisoners recalled seeing for the first time a disciplined military that did not rely on whips or shouting. This treatment gradually eased their initial fears, leaving an indescribable feeling. Part relief, part suspicion, and part bewilderment. Alongside this surprise came silent comparisons. While their parents, spouses, and children back home suffered under bombs, hunger, and deprivation, the defeated prisoners themselves were enjoying better conditions. Many even felt guilty. One German soldier wrote in his diary, "We, the defeated, eat meat and smoke while our families back home don't even have enough rye bread." This sense of contradiction left a deep mark from the very first days in America. From 1943, when the first camps in Texas and Oklahoma began operating, to 1945, the network of German POW camps had spread across more than 500 locations in the United States. Yet the opening chapter of the story was always the same. Emaciated soldiers exhausted from North Africa and Europe were escorted onto ships across the Atlantic, filled with fear, only to finally breathe a sigh of relief upon realizing that their enemy was not the monsters propaganda had described. This marked the beginning of a very special experience, a period of captivity that many Germans would later recall not with resentment but with gratitude and nostalgia. As the initial days of astonishment and bewilderment gradually passed, the life of German prisoners in U.S. camps began to settle into a stable routine. The United States, with its abundant resources and respect for the Geneva Convention, established a clear management system that ensured security while allowing prisoners to maintain an orderly life. Each camp had a set of rules issued as soon as the prisoners arrived. They had to follow strict schedules: wake up, roll call, breakfast, work, rest, dinner, lights out. However, these regulations were not so harsh as to feel suffocating. On the contrary, they created a steady rhythm that helped many prisoners quickly adapt to their new circumstances. One notable feature of camp life was organized labor. As early as 1943, the U.S. War Department recognized that leaving hundreds of thousands of prisoners idle would not only waste manpower, but also pose a risk of disorder. Under the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be assigned work as long as it was not directly related to the war effort. Therefore, they were assigned to farms, sawmills, food processing plants, and infrastructure construction projects. Agricultural labor became particularly important, as many young Americans had gone to fight, leaving significant labor shortages in rural states. Initially cautious, American farmers soon realized that German prisoners worked diligently, and some even possessed modern farming techniques. In return, prisoners received a nominal wage, usually in the form of camp-issued scrip to buy extra food, cigarettes, or personal items from the camp canteen. These jobs also offered prisoners opportunities to interact with local civilians. At first, American farmers were visibly wary. These were the enemies who had pointed guns at their sons in North Africa or Italy just months earlier. Over time, shared lunches in the fields and exchanges in broken English gradually reduced the distance. Some farming families even kept a few favorite prisoners to work repeatedly, treating them almost like acquaintances. These experiences left deep impressions on both sides. Years after the war, many former prisoners wrote letters or returned to the U.S. to visit families who had shared a hot meal with them after long work days. Inside the camps, beyond labor, prisoners also had access to recreational and cultural activities. Sports were especially important. Regular games of soccer, volleyball, basketball, and baseball helped maintain physical fitness and team spirit. These games sometimes drew spectators, American guards or local civilians, turning the tense atmosphere of a prison camp into something resembling a small stadium. Soccer, popular in Europe, allowed prisoners to express pride, while baseball helped them become familiar with American culture. Prisoners also organized music, theater, and academic clubs. Many had been students, teachers, or musicians before the war. They brought these skills into the camps, forming choirs, bands, or teaching mathematics, foreign languages, and literature to fellow inmates. In some larger camps, prisoners even printed internal newsletters in German, featuring poems, short stories, camp news, and occasional satirical illustrations of daily life. These activities helped maintain morale and a sense of dignity, even under U.S. supervision. Simple pastimes like playing chess, reading in the camp library, or walking around the fenced compound were also important. Libraries were often supplied by the Red Cross or donations from American civic organizations. For many prisoners, it was their first exposure to American literature through translations or a chance to learn English from old textbooks. Some took the opportunity to continue their education, treating the camp as an unexpected university during their confinement. The combination of labor, sports, and cultural activities turned many camps into organized micro-communities. Rather than bleak, the atmosphere was often lively. Of course, it was not always peaceful. Occasional fights broke out, particularly between die-hard Nazis and those who had begun questioning the regime. Nevertheless, compared with what was typical in Europe, camp life in the U.S. was strikingly humane and stable. An interesting detail was the role of cigarettes and beer. Cigarettes served as a common currency in the camp. Prisoners used them to trade for everything from a sweater to a warmer sleeping spot in winter. Beer was less common, but on holidays or after completing work successfully, the camp might provide a can to each prisoner. For young soldiers accustomed to harsh frontline conditions, sitting down to drink beer in the camp was both unbelievable and bittersweet. These small, everyday details left a lasting impression on many. Relations between prisoners and American guards were also notable. Initially, both sides maintained distance, but daily interactions gradually built mutual understanding. Some guards learned a few German phrases, while prisoners learned English. Small acts of humanity occurred frequently, a guard sharing leftover food, an American quietly showing a family photo, a prisoner gifting a handmade wooden keychain. These seemingly minor gestures symbolized a larger truth. Once the uniform was removed, the enemy was just another human being with a family, dreams, and fears. Of course, suspicion and tension persisted. Some prisoners remained staunchly Nazi, viewing all acts of American kindness as deceit. They imposed strict discipline on fellow inmates and sometimes assaulted those who appeared overly friendly with guards or expressed anti-Hitler views. Such incidents forced U.S. authorities to isolate extremist groups in separate areas. Yet the majority of prisoners, especially younger ones, gradually accepted reality. Life in the camp, with labor, sports, education, and even beer and cigarettes, was clearly not the hell propaganda had claimed. All these factors made the POW experience in the U.S. paradoxical. Confined and deprived of freedom, yet many remembered it as more comfortable than life at the front. They worked with purpose, had leisure time, had friends among fellow prisoners, and had enough to eat. In the context of World War II, when much of the world was engulfed in fire and millions starved, this was an extraordinary exception. Daily life in the camps laid the groundwork for many prisoners' intellectual and emotional reflections, fostering deeper thoughts about war, the enemy, and their own country. Beneath the surface of stability provided by organized labor and daily routines, there existed a quiet but intense struggle, a war of ideology. Among the hundreds of thousands of German prisoners held in the United States, not everyone was the same. Some maintained unwavering faith in Hitler and Nazism, viewing any humanitarian gestures by Americans as mere deception. Others, especially younger prisoners, or those who had harbored doubts before, began to waver, questioning the beliefs they had once held. This division gradually created two opposing groups within the camps, generating a complex atmosphere. The group loyal to Nazism called themselves Die Gläubigen, the faithful. They valued strict discipline, continued performing the Hitler salute, sang propaganda songs, and hung portraits of the Führer in the barracks. They held secret meetings, reading newspapers or manifestos that had somehow slipped through the mail fence. To them, the defeats in North Africa or Italy were only temporary, and the belief that Germany will rise again still burned strongly. These prisoners quickly asserted control over their fellow inmates. Anyone who showed excessive friendliness toward American guards or expressed dissenting opinions was regarded as a traitor. In contrast, the moderate group gradually grew over time. They included those exhausted after years of fighting, those disillusioned by propaganda, and young men who had never held deep faith in Hitler. Life in the camps, with ample food, books, music, sports, and even ordinary conversations with American soldiers, led them to reconsider everything. They asked themselves, if the enemy were truly cruel, why were they treated with such kindness? If the Nazis truly protected the people, why were families back home suffering from bombs and hunger while they, the defeated soldiers, were well fed? These contradictions gradually shook beliefs built on a tightly controlled propaganda system. The conflict between the two groups was not limited to debates. In many camps, internal violence occurred. Extremists organized shadow courts, punishing those deemed traitors through beatings and even murder. Some incidents were severe enough to shock the American public. For example, at a camp in Oklahoma in 1943, a young prisoner was strangled to death simply for expressing a desire to surrender fully and distance himself from Nazi influence. U.S. military police intervened, arrested suspects, and decided to separate the extremists from the general population. Special camps were established to confine die-hard Hitler loyalists, preventing them from controlling their fellow inmates. Even when separated, however, the influence of Nazi ideology did not entirely vanish. It lingered like a ghost, haunting prisoners during long nights of reflection. Some struggled with guilt. Were they betraying their homeland by accepting the enemy's kindness? Others led double lives, outwardly obedient to American guards, while pretending loyalty in the barracks to avoid scrutiny from extreme comrades. This internal struggle created an invisible tension throughout many camps. Meanwhile, the Americans recognized the importance of the ideological front. The War Department and intelligence agencies seized the opportunity to conduct a subtle, psychological war. Certain camps were selected for educational experiments. Prisoners were exposed to democratic newspapers, documentary films about the U.S., and discussion sessions led by American university professors. The goal was not to brainwash prisoners, but to sow seeds of doubt about totalitarianism while introducing values of freedom, rule of law, and human dignity. The effectiveness of these measures varied. For extremists, they had little impact and often provoked anger. For most younger prisoners, however, exposure became an important catalyst. They began keeping diaries with a different tone, less hatred, more acknowledgement that American society, though unfamiliar, held a certain appeal. Some even regarded the camp as their first democratic school in life. Psychological impact also came from everyday details. One prisoner wrote, "I saw American soldiers sharing sandwiches with each other regardless of rank. In the German army, that could never happen. Here, they treated each other as friends, not superiors and subordinates." Such small, repeated observations gradually dismantled the propaganda wall in many minds. Prisoners realized that the enemy portrayed by the Nazis was far from the reality. This shift in perception did not happen all at once. It was a slow process, eroding old beliefs step by step. Some were shaken within months, others took a year or more. By the final stages of the war, especially after 1944, when news of Germany's defeat spread, most prisoners in the U.S. no longer held blind faith in Hitler. They began to think about returning home, wondering what the future of Germany would be and what role they, former soldiers of a defeated regime, would play. An important consequence of this change was that many prisoners became a core force in post-war denazification. Returning home, they carried with them unique experiences from American camps. Memories of plentiful meals, soccer games, language lessons, and above all, the realization that the enemy could retain their humanity. These experiences made it easier for them to accept the new democratic order than those who had never left Germany. In short, life in U.S. POW camps was not only about physical survival, but also a process of mental transformation. From initial fear and despair, German prisoners confronted themselves, their challenged beliefs, pressures from extremist comrades, and the astonishing kindness of the enemy. This ideological struggle sometimes led to violence and suffering, but ultimately it opened a new path, a path toward awakening and reconciliation rather than permanent hatred. When the war in Europe ended in May 1945, Germany lay in ruins. Berlin was devastated, millions had died, millions more were homeless, and the country was divided. Meanwhile, in the United States, hundreds of thousands of German prisoners remained in camps, awaiting repatriation under Allied arrangements. Returning them to Germany took months, even years, as the U.S. and Britain sought to use this workforce to aid reconstruction in Europe or fill labor shortages in agriculture. For many prisoners, this was a unique period. The war had ended, yet they were not truly home. During this period, their mindset shifted dramatically. Many began comparing life in the U.S. camps with the grim prospects awaiting them in their ruined homeland. In America, they had enough to eat, access to medical care, books, music, and even cigarettes and beer on special occasions. In contrast, in Germany, their families struggled with hunger, deprivation, and unprecedented destruction. Many prisoners admitted in their memoirs that they felt torn. On one hand, they longed to reunite with family. On the other, they feared confronting the harsh post-war reality in Europe. Numerous personal accounts highlight the lasting impact of their experiences in the U.S. One prisoner recalled reading, for the first time in his life, books that had been banned by the Nazis. Another remembered afternoons spent playing soccer or baseball with American soldiers, where the enemy temporarily became teammates. Some recalled local families who hired them for farm work, occasionally inviting them to share a family meal. These small memories stood in stark contrast to the brutal memories of the war they had just survived. After returning home, many former prisoners carried these memories throughout their lives. In reunions or veteran gatherings, they rarely spoke of the humiliation of capture. Instead, they recounted the time in America as a strange but memorable chapter. Some described that, even in confinement, they were able to live as normal human beings, free from military orders and propaganda control. For them, U.S. POW camps became rare spaces of inner freedom amid the storm of history. Notably, after the war, some former prisoners even returned to the United States to settle. They sought contact with families they had interacted with during farm work or chose America as a place to begin a new life. This reflects that the camp experience not only shaped individuals, but also helped forge lasting bonds between two peoples once on opposite sides of the conflict. From the U.S. perspective, the treatment of German prisoners left an important legacy. It demonstrated that adherence to the Geneva Convention and the preservation of humanity in wartime was not only a legal obligation but also a shrewd strategy. Through this humane approach, the U.S. reduced the risk of unrest in camps, fostered goodwill among enemy soldiers, and even contributed to post-war reconciliation. As Germany rebuilt, many former prisoners who had been in America became tangible bridges, recounting to their fellow citizens that Americans were not as cruel as we were taught to believe. Memories of beer, cigarettes, baseball games, or slices of pie in the camps thus became more than personal recollections. They became symbols that, even in the harshest circumstances, humanity could endure. In the history of World War II, the experience of German prisoners in the U.S. stands as evidence that humane treatment, however small, can leave a longer-lasting impact than military victories. When World War II officially ended in 1945, a new chapter began for the German prisoners in the United States. They left the camps with their freedom but also carried profound questions about life, loyalty, and humanity. For many, their experiences in the U.S. camps were not merely memories of safety, sufficient food, or bottles of beer, and packs of cigarettes, but lessons about human nature, humane treatment, and the power of principles. The years spent in the camps opened a new horizon for the prisoners. They observed that those they had been taught to see as ruthless enemies were, in fact, ordinary people with laughter, hobbies, and the capacity for kindness. Playing sports, reading books, working on farms, and receiving symbolic wages taught them an important lesson. Humanity is not just an abstract concept or an international law, but a practical force that maintains order, reduces conflict, and strengthens morale. Small gestures, a slice of pie, an apple, or a light-hearted comment, could shift perceptions, undermining beliefs instilled by years of propaganda. One of the most important lessons German prisoners learned was the conflict between loyalty to the regime and the reality of life. They had once believed wholeheartedly in Nazi teachings, viewing Americans as brutal enemies, yet their experiences in U.S. camps forced them to confront a different reality. Enemies could also be kind and fair. Seemingly trivial moments, sipping beer, smoking a cigarette, or playing sports under the open sky, became symbols that broke down prejudice. These experiences shook rigid beliefs and prompted prisoners to question, if the enemy can show kindness, what then of old propaganda? The humane behavior of Americans toward prisoners was not only a moral quality, but also a clever strategy. Respect for international law, adherence to the Geneva Convention, and decent living conditions helped reduce conflict in the camps, maintain order, and build trust. Prisoners cooperated better in labor, caused fewer disturbances, and gradually adapted to camp life, creating a safer environment for both sides. This demonstrates that humanity does not conflict with military efficiency. On the contrary, it can serve as an effective management and strategic tool. Personal stories also show the long-lasting impact on perspectives of war and post-war reconciliation. Many former prisoners maintained contact with Americans who had treated them well. Some even returned to settle in the U.S., creating lasting bonds between two nations once at war. Memories of kindness, fairness, and ordinary human interactions helped them view history not solely through the lens of victory or defeat, but through the lens of humanity. From the American side, the management of prisoners became an important historical lesson. It showed that even in total war, upholding ethical principles and international law not only protects national reputation, but has practical effects, reducing violence, improving labor morale, and building long-term bridges for reconciliation. In many cases, humane treatment of German prisoners indirectly influenced military and political strategy. When German officials learned that prisoners were treated well in America, they had to reconsider harsh treatment of Allied prisoners. Another noteworthy aspect is the psychological and cultural impact. German prisoners experienced small but meaningful everyday moments, reading, playing sports, sharing meals, listening to music, or simply talking with each other and with American soldiers. These moments helped preserve their character, sense of dignity, and independent thinking even while confined. They also disrupted propaganda narratives, showing that even during war, education and cultural experience can reshape human perceptions. This experience left important lessons about tolerance and reconciliation. When prisoners returned to Germany, they carried positive memories of former enemies, serving as living witnesses that not all was hatred and violence. They recounted stories of kindness, of beer and cigarettes, of sports games and hospitable American families, contributing to a shift in the next generation's perspective on war, the opponent, and humanity. Another profound lesson was the value of surprise and reflection. When people are treated kindly where cruelty is expected, they are forced to reconsider old beliefs. For many prisoners, this experience shook their absolute loyalty to the regime, revealing that life and human nature were not entirely dictated by propaganda. This shows that humanity can be the strongest weapon, not through ammunition, but through the power to change perceptions and beliefs. In conclusion, the experience of German prisoners in the United States during World War II represents a unique chapter in war history, where humanity, international principles, and human experience rose above violence and military victories. Bottles of beer, cigarettes, sports games, and hearty meals all became symbols of soft power, reconciliation, and the enduring value of humanity. They demonstrate that even in the harshest circumstances, kindness can survive, break prejudice, alter perspectives, and leave a lasting spiritual legacy. Today, reflecting on these stories, we learn not only about war but also about how humans can preserve dignity, compassion, and integrity even in the most difficult circumstances. These lessons remain relevant in modern society. Kindness, principles, and humanity are never outdated, and sometimes they are the most powerful tools to build bridges, eliminate hatred, and create lasting peace.